Most of you probably know the story all about Joseph very well. Joseph was the son of Jacob, one of his younger sons, and at the time he was the youngest. And there was one that came later on. But he was spoilt by his father, as you probably know. And it seems that the Broadway, the theatres, West End and all that made an absolute killing, didn't they, out of Joseph and his Technicolor Dreamcoat. It was such a catching story that people all over the world just wanted to see the theatre production of that. And maybe you've been to see that at some point yourself. I remember somebody took me to it for a birthday many, many years ago. And it is quite amazing to see the Bible come to life in that way. But let's remember that it's not just a theatre production. It's not just a story. It's a real account of what happened to one young man and how God dealt with him through that. So let's pick up the story. We've got to the stage where Joseph has annoyed his brothers to the point, remember, that he was having these dreams. And if Joseph was guilty of anything, it was probably that he was unwise. Where he should have perhaps kept his mouth shut, he opened it too much. And probably some of us are guilty of the same sort of things. But he ruffled the feathers of his brothers to the point that they ended up trying to get rid of him, and he finished up in slavery in Egypt. And this is where we pick up the story. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. And when his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. And Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. And the blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in his house and in the field. And so he left in Joseph's care everything he had. And with Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Well, we're going to come back and look at that passage in just a few moments' time. But let me just ask you one or two questions for those of you that are working, for those of you that have been to work in the past in a paid employment situation. How do you view your job? Is it one of those things? I mean, we often hear, don't we, talk about the Monday morning blues. Now, if I'm really honest with you, I never fully understood the Monday morning blues, and I think that's because even when I was working, I am working, I promise you. Even when I was working in a secular job, let me just clarify that, I never really had a problem with Monday mornings. I actually quite enjoyed the work that I was doing. But for a lot of people, that's not the case, is it? For a lot of people, they go to work on a Monday morning just dreading it, thinking, oh no, the weekend has finished. Roll on next weekend. And I wonder, do you feel like that? And I say that about people who are in paid employment, but let's understand that work is more than just paid employment. Because actually we're all engaged in work, whether we're employed in some kind of work that gives us a monetary reward for that, or whether we're at home looking after the home we've got. That's all work, isn't it? It's just you don't get paid by somebody else for it. And sometimes there are other jobs that we do too, outside of the home, but this will work. Now, that could be studying. That's a form of work. It might be volunteering in some situation. That's a form of work. Whatever we do, actually, we're engaged in work. Now, the general view of work for around about 1500 years in the church was not actually that good. Work was viewed by the church until around about 1500, and in fact even beyond that, as being part of the curse. It was as a result of our sin that we ended up with hard labour. Now, if we go back to Genesis and we explore what happened in the beginning, God creates the universe. He creates this little paradise in which he then puts human beings that he creates. And they have this wonderful time where they're not having to do hard work. Everything is it's just happening around them, so it seems. So they're not having to work for their food. The trees are producing and they're eating. So that's really easy, isn't it? The weeds aren't growing, and the brambles and all the things that give us bother today on the land, they're not there. Sin wasn't there at all. It was all harmonious. It was this Eden paradise. But then Satan tempted them to sin, and things altered dramatically after that. And as part of the punishment, part of the curse that came upon mankind, we find that God says to the woman, he says, you will have pain in childbirth. And I think there is, of course, the physical pain associated with that. But let's be honest about it, that having children sometimes, it's not just childbirth where the pain is it? It's actually the pain can go on. Sometimes our children can cause great grief in our hearts. Why? Because of sin. But secondly, he said to the man, by the sweat of your brow you will work the earth. You're going to have to work hard for your food. And trust me, very often when I'm out in the garden trying to get rid of all those brambles that grow at the end of my garden, the stinging nettles that come up uninvited, I often say to myself, if I could just meet Adam face to face right now, I'd give him a good piece of my mind. Look what he's caused for me. But we're all guilty, aren't we? We're all sinners. And so the church, for about 1500 years, taught people that the hard work that you have to do and the pain that you have to endure is part of God's punishment on us as the human race for disobeying him. And then in 1517, so just over 500 years ago, in October 31st, 1517, a name that you'll probably know about, Martin Luther, came along. And he was a monk, a friar, and he went to the church door in Wittenberg, and he had been having this revelation from God, and I don't think this happened overnight by any means, but he completely disagreed with so many things that the church, which was the Catholic Church at the time, that the church was doing and teaching. And so he wrote out his 95 theses and nailed them to the church door. I'm told it was all in Latin. I'm not sure how much the people managed to read and understand of it all, but he did that anyway. And he probably thought he was going to get a slap across the wrist from the bishops for such a thing as this, and he'd vented his anger kind of thing. But of course, it actually created a total revolution. Went to the very core of the church, upset the Pope himself. And we ended up with what we would now call the Reformation. And the Reformation came in and was predominantly, in those early days, effective in Northern Europe. And various key characters kind of picked up on the Reformation, and they started to think about this and discuss it and develop it. And as with any new idea, that as time goes on, so it grows, it develops, and it becomes a bit more mature. And that's what really happened with the Reformation, because there were some things that Martin Luther believed that today you might kind of raise your eyebrows at some of the things that he believed to his very dying day. But we've got to understand and give him credit for the fact that he was trying to listen to God, but he had been brought up all his life through a Roman Catholic system, which taught a false theology. And he was being enlightened to that. And he was the one who was given the courage to set things in motion. A little while later, another key character in Reformation history came along. And he was a Frenchman by the name of John Calvin. And Calvin was also very influential in giving teaching on the Reformation. He brought in something that we would call today of predestination. Now, I say brought it in, it wasn't his idea. It was already there in Scripture, but he recognized it in Scripture, and he began to bring that out and to teach exactly what the Bible says on this idea of predestination. And predestination was this, basically, that God has a plan for your life, that everything is mapped out, that he knows everything you say before you say it, every thought in your heart before you think it. He knows everything you're going to do, every move you're going to make before you do it. You cannot surprise God. He knows all about that. And therefore, he also knows at the end of time who will be with him in his glory and who won't. The elect. Who has God selected? Who has he put his Holy Spirit on to bring them to faith? Because that's not a work of ourselves, that's a work of God himself. Now, the problem with that is that people could have two kinds of responses to that kind of teaching, and many took that to heart greatly. One response to that teaching is that you could say, therefore, if God has selected, and I actually really get no choice in the matter, I might as well live my life in any way that I choose. Why should I bother about trying to be someone who follows God's laws, etc.? Because if I'm predestined, I'm going to get there anyway. And if I'm not, then I'm not going to get there, no matter what I do. So I can live my life any way I want to. That's one possible response. But actually, the response that came was totally different. It was really the opposite. People were extra careful. And the reason for this, I think, is because many of them felt that they had the presence of God upon them, that he had changed their lives, transformed them, given them new life, and therefore they wanted to demonstrate and prove that that new life was there. And so they began to live lives that had been completely and utterly changed. Now, coming out of all of that, and this lifestyle that these Reformed Christians began to live, was a different attitude to material things in life. They shunned material things. One of the notable things about the Calvinist churches is that they were very plain. And certainly in the UK, where Calvinism had a great influence here, but we would probably know more of Calvinism through the Puritans. The Puritans were usually Calvinists, and the Puritan churches, so particularly in the UK, they were very austere churches. When you went into the Puritan churches, the walls were painted a very dull, almost a grey really. It didn't want anything bright. The Puritans themselves looked very drab. They didn't like to dress up in anything that was showy. So they were very plain and simple. They ate very simply. The furniture in their homes was very basic. Everything about them was very simple because they did not want to get caught up in the things of this world. So they only had the very basic things. And beyond that, they didn't want to know. But they also had a different attitude to work. And they worked incredibly hard. And these people, these Calvinists and the Puritans, and that they taught that people should work with all their heart. That they should work as if they were working for the Lord. And that's scriptural too. And so they worked very hard. But you see, the thing is that when you've got hard-working people who are really, putting the hours in, putting the effort in, not slacking in any way, motivated by the idea that this was part of the evidence that they were part of the elect who had been saved, you're going to start generating money. The problem is they didn't spend money. So what did they do with it? Well, they reinvested it, and it went back into industry. Now, around about 100 years ago, or just perhaps a little bit more now, there was a German sociologist that you may have come across, Max Weber. And Weber was an interesting character because he wrote a book where he explored the link between what was called the Protestant ethic, or sometimes the Protestant work ethic, and capitalism. And he realized that those countries that had been influenced by the Reformation and become the Protestant countries, mainly therefore in Northern Europe, had become more prosperous than those countries that had stayed with Roman Catholicism or other religions around the world, or tribal systems, feudalism, all of these kinds of places around the world were much less prosperous than in Northern Europe, where the Reformation had taken hold. And he saw that there was a direct link between the two. In fact, he saw that what happened in the Reformation, and particularly in Calvinism, had laid down the seeds for capitalism. Karl Marx, he saw it the other way round. He saw religion as being the opiate of the people, the drug of the people, and he saw it that actually it was a way of getting people to work hard, believing that their reward was in heaven, not here on earth. So they worked hard and they worked happy, trying to attain something that they would never get in this life. So he kind of took the other way, though, and he said basically that it was because of the capitalism that religion prospered, because the capitalists realised that religion was the key to them making more and more money. And so completely opposite to Weber. Weber saw it that it was the church, the religion, that was actually giving the seeds for capitalism to grow. And saying that the reason for that is because these people didn't spend the money, they just kept reinvesting. And so you find that there were many very large businesses around, employing hundreds, sometimes thousands of people that were owned by Christians. And a lot of the big names that we still know today, Cadbury's, for example, was owned by Christians. Tate and Lyle and the sugar people, owned by Christians. And the whole thing was that they weren't spending the money. They weren't being like we would today. Many capitalists today, they do it. Why do they do it? Because they want a big house somewhere. Richard Branson has his island, Necker Island, out in the Caribbean. And probably several other properties too. Well, you wouldn't have got that with these Calvinists. I mean, they would have shunned that kind of thing. That was showy. and they wanted to live very simple lives. Their money got reinvested, and it spread across many of the Northern Europe countries, whether it was in Germany, in the UK, particularly in England and Wales, and even in Scotland. The Scottish Presbyterians very much lived the frugal life and invested into business. Going across into the Scandinavian countries, it was everywhere. But they became very, very prosperous as a result. Why am I telling you all of this? What has that got to do with our passage? Well, look, I'm not sure that they got everything absolutely right. And as one person at least, and probably many others, but one person I was reading recently said, there is an irony that out of the church came capitalism. Now, I don't actually totally agree with that statement, because I don't think capitalism came out of the church. I think, perhaps as Weber said, the seeds were laid by the teaching of the church. But this person said, the irony is this, that Jesus taught that you should live simple lives. The one who's got 2 cloaks should give one away to somebody who has none. Those kinds of things. So he said, so how is it then, out of a teaching of Christianity from Christ that taught to live a very simple life, how is it that capitalism has arisen? And capitalism is basically the exploitation of others. It's taking something, buying it in at the lowest possible price you can get and selling it at the highest possible price. That's what capitalism is. How did we get this injustice of exploiting others out of Christianity? Well, there's a brief history of where we've got to and how we've ended up where we are today. But we do live in a capitalist society, whether we like it or not. And we have to try as much as we can to make the right choices, and therefore to try and live just lives, lives that are fair and take into consideration those who are around us too. That we shouldn't be focused on the money making. That's really not what it's all about. We shouldn't be focused on having all the latest, greatest things that are out there. That's materialism and consumerism, which are very often the enemies of the cross, quite frankly. So we do need to kind of live that balanced life. I'm not asking you to all become Puritans. And if you all sort of come in next week dressed more like Puritans, I will feel that I failed today, because I'm not asking you to do that. But what I am saying is that we do need to be a bit careful, don't we, about how we use the resources that God has given to us. Can we use them better for somebody else as well? Can we take what we've got, the plenty that we have, to supply the needs of those who have very little? That's how we should be acting and responding. But we want to talk specifically today about, as I've called it, Monday worship. We're very good at Sunday worship, of coming to church and living the Christian life and trying to get close to God on Sundays. But what happens on Monday? Is there a disconnect between what we do here on church and what happens on Monday morning? Because there shouldn't be. There should be a connection. And actually that's exactly what the Calvinists and the Puritans and the Lutherans and the Presbyterians and lots of other groups, that's exactly what they were trying to say, is that you can't come to church and pretend to be one thing and then on Monday be something different. This has to affect what you do on Monday morning. In fact, your whole life can be an expression of worship, because when you live your life to please God, then he is being honoured and glorified. And what is worship? It's honouring and glorifying God. So when we can live and say, I have a clear conscience about the things that I do on a Monday, then we're pleasing God, aren't we? And remember, that doesn't necessarily have to be paid employment. It's whatever we do. It's there to please God. I just read an interesting little book by Tim Chester, which deals with the theology of washing dishes. Now, you wouldn't believe you get a whole book out of that. But it was a fascinating read. And I kind of read this very smugly, thinking to myself, thanks, Tim, this is really great to see the theology of washing dishes, as I then think, well, I ought to just load the dishwasher now. I don't need to worry too much about that. But the principles are there. That as we wash the dishes or do any other menial chores, do we do it to the glory of God? How do you do it to the glory of God? Well, he would outline things like this, such as when we wash the dishes. He starts his book off by saying, how do you know when a legalist is washing the dishes? And the answer is, according to Chester, that you know when a legalist washes the dishes because they do the bare minimum to say they've done the dishes. But when somebody puts their heart into it, he says, they do the dishes and do it properly. Not only do they wash them, but they dry them, I have to confess I've discovered a little bit of a legalist when it comes to the dishes, because I will very often wash them, put them and say, oh, just let them drain, and walk away for a bit. They'll dry on their own. But he says, but when you put your heart into it, and it's not just legalistic, he says, not only do you do that, but you even wash the saucepans too. Don't just leave them to soak. He says, you wipe down the surfaces and make sure everything is clean and tidy again. He goes on to say that part of that is because we want to reflect God's character, and God who made order out of chaos. What happens, I don't know about your house, but certainly after we've been preparing a meal, the kitchen does look like a bomb has hit it. It is absolute chaos. Well, we want order out of the chaos. And that's actually something built inside of us. I think that is part of us, that we should feel a little bit riled when things are chaotic. We want things to be peaceful. He goes on to talk about the creativity of God as well. And you might think, how do you get creative washing the dishes? Well, he doesn't just talk about dishes, he extends that a bit further out. But he talks about the fact that we are creative people, and so therefore we want to do things using our imagination and being creative people. He talks about the fact that we want to serve, and doing the dishes, serving somebody else, and we need to be serving others because God has also got the servant heart. Jesus Christ came to serve, not to be served. All of those kinds of things, and when you go through this whole book on washing dishes, but then apply the principles still further into life, you see that it makes an awful lot of sense by taking something so menial and everyday and common, and to realise that actually in our everyday lives we are supposed to be people who are displaying the glory of God in everything that we do. And sometimes we don't feel that it's right for us to be doing what we're doing. It's beneath us. We feel annoyed that we've ended up doing a certain task. Do you ever feel like that? When you go to work, do you feel happy that you've got a job? Or do you resent the fact that you've got to go to work? Do you feel that your job is a result of the curse because man sinned? Or do you feel that it's a blessing? Because that was the difference that came with the reformers, that they taught that work was not a result of the curse, but it is actually God's blessing upon our lives, that he gives us occupation and something to do. Well, look, I want to look for a few minutes at Genesis 39. I was rather struck by this story, account of Joseph. He found himself in a place where he didn't intend to be. He was in Egypt. He shouldn't have been in Egypt. He was sold into slavery. He should have been a free person. He was sold into slavery by none other than his own brothers, his own flesh and blood. No way should that have happened. All sorts of things in Joseph's life had gone terribly wrong. And I wonder how you might have felt if you were on the receiving end of what Joseph had to endure. If it was your own flesh and blood that had plotted your death, but then had relented and sold you into slavery instead, which frankly was almost as good as a death sentence. How would you have felt towards your family, those who had abused you? How would you have felt towards God, the one whom you'd served? And Joseph had tried to connect with God, and he obviously did have a connection with God. He was quite clearly somebody who had a relationship with God. Do you feel that because of your relationship with God that everything should go well in your life? Do you feel that he should be blessing you with all the things that you want as a result of that? A lot of Christians do. It's not uncommon to feel that kind of way. When things start to go wrong in your life, what do? Do you blame somebody? Do you blame yourself? Are you one of those people who kind of looks deep inside and say, what did I do wrong that God is punishing me at this stage? Is it indeed a punishment at all? Those are the kinds of questions that we're sometimes left with. And sometimes when we go to work, whether, whatever that type of work is, whether we're studying, whether we're in paid employment, whether we're at home, whether we're volunteering, whatever it might be, sometimes we can ask the question, why me? Why do I had great dreams for my life. I wanted to do this. I was an ambitious person who once upon a time said I was going to do this, that, and the other. And now my life is reduced to the mundane. I have trials that I have to deal with, things that I never thought that I would have. I know that when I got married and said in sickness and in health that I didn't actually believe that there would be sickness, but now it's upon me. How do I deal with that? All those kinds of questions can go through our minds, can't they? Why me? Why should I go through all of this? Well, look, let's just pick out a few things from Joseph's life. And just this particular portion of Joseph's life, because I think we can see some great insights here too. Let's look at the fact that, first of all, verse 1 says that Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. He was put into slavery, in other words. His brothers, who were going to kill him, suddenly saw a caravan of Ishmaelites. They were actually the slaves, in fact. Remember that they were the descendants of Hagar and Abraham. Hagar was the slave woman. She remained a slave woman. Even after she was sent out from Abraham, dismissed from service as Sarah's attendant, she is still really the slave woman. Her son was born into slavery. They were the slaves. And yet, it was the children of the free woman who sold one of their own into slavery. That in itself is despicable. And these descendants of the slave delighted in the fact that they were able to take one of the children of the free and put them into bondage. Joseph could have resented that fact. I doubt very much that the irony was lost on him. I'm sure that he knew the story well. I'm sure it had been passed on, all about his grandfather Abraham, the remarkable life that he lived, and how Jacob came about, and Isaac and Jacob. He must have known all about these things. So why? Why has he been taken, carted off? An uncertain future, sold into slavery. The first thing I want you to notice is that it was no fault of his own. As I mentioned earlier, that if he did do anything wrong, it was that he was unwise. He was a young man, and he was boasting about his dreams, what God has said to him. But he was unwise in sharing those dreams. The dreams, in those dreams where he was always the successful one and his brothers were the ones who were bowing down to him. And that really got under their skin. But through no fault of his own, he found himself imprisoned. First of all in a cistern, an empty water hole, whilst they decided what to do with him. We're going to kill him. Let's get rid of him. But he'd done nothing actually wrong. He suffered injustice, in other words. Do you suffer injustice? Are there things in your life that you think that's not fair? Isn't that the cry of children? Children are blessed with this amazing sense of what is fair and just and right. And every child learns at a very early age to be able to say, it's not fair. But actually the truth is that as we get older, we still have that sense of it's not fair. We may not express it in those same ways, but we feel it. We feel the injustice. And sometimes those injustices are quite small, and sometimes they're huge. The question is, do you look at your life and say, why? Why has this happened to me? This is not right. This is an injustice. I'm in the situation that I face now because I have been wronged. Because somebody deliberately tried to harm me, or someone in my family that I've ended up where I am today. It's not fair, injustice. But the second thing I want you to notice is that it was a result of an evil plan. There was duplicity in this. There was a lot of deception going on in this. The plan was to kill him. And after that he was killed, that they would deceive their own father by telling him, your favourite son must have been taken by wild animals. In fact, they even did that. They deceived the father. Look, we found that wonderful coat you bought him, all covered in blood. Might have been animal's blood that it was covered in, but they didn't have DNA in those days. So Jacob takes it, he looks at it, and he thinks, the only logical conclusion that we can reach is indeed that Joseph was taken by wild animals. They send their own father into deep grief and mourning. The shock of learning that his son had been taken, his favourite son. Now again, we could look at that and say that shouldn't have been either, but it did. And again, I think that's part of the jealousy that was there and existed with the brothers. They were fed up with their father having the favourite in Joseph. And so what we see is that this evil plan, this duplicity, this deception of the whole thing started off as jealousy for their younger brother, but it led to attempted murder and to selling their own flesh and blood into slavery, which could have led to his death. Many slaves did not survive long. They were treated very poorly. But I want you to notice in verse 2 that in Joseph's case, things are a little bit different. Because in verse 2 it says, the Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with him. Reminds me a bit of that very famous picture and little piece that goes with it of the footsteps in the sand. Most of you will know that well. The questioning of God as he looks at the picture and he sees the footsteps in the sand, and there are two lots, and when he gets to the most difficult place in his life, there's only one set of footsteps. And so he challenges God and he says, where did you go? Why is there only one set of footsteps in the sand when I reach the most difficult bits of my life? Why did you abandon me, God? And the Lord answers and says, I didn't abandon you, I carried you. I carried you. That's why there's one set of footsteps. And in a sense, what Joseph is finding here is that the Lord carried him at this point, that he brought him through that. The Lord was with him, and he may not have realized it. And I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that he had all sorts of things going around in his head. And we're not told how he reacted towards God, but certainly in the long term, he remained faithful to the Lord throughout. The Lord was with him. So although he was in slavery, he wasn't alone. Even though sometimes we go through situations in life where we don't want to be, that we're there not because of our own fault. This was never part of my plan. I didn't intend to be where I am, kind of thing. But is the Lord with you? Yes, he is. But are you with him? Because that's another question, isn't it? I believe that Joseph remained faithful to the Lord throughout all of this. In fact, he probably was crying out to the Lord more than ever because of the predicament that he was in. Lord, what's happening to me? What about all those dreams I had where I was rising into places of authority and power? Where's all that now? I'm sinking to the bottom. I'm in the slave market. I'm literally chained up, shackled, waiting for somebody to come and decide my fate. And indeed, his fate was decided when a very prominent Egyptian came along and bought him and took him into his own household. Slavery of the captain of the guards, very influential military man. I can imagine that being the slave of a military man was not easy. You can just kind of imagine, can't you, that I would think, and maybe I'm reading into this a bit too much, you can take this how you like, but I would imagine he was probably quite a cold, calculating character. I would imagine that he was a very decisive man. Military men usually are. They can often be very cruel. There have been some violent robberies in the home counties just recently. Just this week, the police have announced, without even knowing who the person is, but they're fairly certain that he is either an ex or current military person. Why? Because of the decisiveness and cruelty and the tactics with which he uses. It's like he's a trained soldier. I suspect Potiphar was the same. You wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of him, particularly if you're a slave and your whole life is totally in his hands. But Joseph prospered in slavery. And I don't know about you, but sometimes if I'm somewhere where I don't want to be, sometimes I don't even want to prosper. This wasn't my plan. This wasn't what I chose for myself. This wasn't the career that I wanted. This wasn't the direction I wanted to go in. Why should I want to prosper in this? No, I want to go back to where I want to be, to do the things that I want to do, and to prosper in the place where I want to prosper. But if God has put you somewhere else, why not prosper where you are? How did he prosper? Well, number one is, verse 2 tells us that he lived in the house of the Egyptian master. I would hazard a guess it was a very fine house, relatively speaking. He was actually brought indoors. Many of the slaves wouldn't have been. Many of the slaves would have been put to work outside in the heat and the elements, working the land, doing other very menial and hard tasks. But Joseph was brought inside. Not only that, but soon his master noticed that Joseph was a very good slave. He did everything that he was asked to do, and he did it well. He did it, as we might say, as though working for the Lord. He didn't let the fact that he was there as a slave, not of his own free will and choice, get in the way, but he still served with all his heart. And as a result, verse 4 tells us that he was favoured by the master. The master looked at him and said, actually, I can trust this guy. Everything he does well. And I suspect that there were many slaves that you couldn't trust. Many slaves who had a chip on their shoulder. Many slaves who got away with as little as they possibly could. Many slaves who would have stolen from their masters. A bit like Onesimus in the New Testament. Many slaves who resented their masters. Many slaves who, given half a chance, would probably even have killed their masters and try to get their own freedom. But Joseph was different, and his master picked up on that and realized that this man was trustworthy and honorable. There was nothing, we're told, that he did not trust Joseph with. He trusted him with his entire household, everything. Verse 3 tells us that not only was he favoured by the master, but he was favoured by God. He was blessed in all he did. Everything he touched, everything he put his hand to, Joseph was successful in it. Why? Because he was diligent. Because he was honest. Because he had the master's interests at heart. Are we like that, even when we're not where we want to be? On a Monday, when you go to work thinking, I don't really want this job. Are we still prepared to be diligent? Joseph was blessed. In fact, we're told that not only was Joseph successful in all he did, but it turns out that the master began to realize that everything in his house began to prosper too. Everything. Now, I suspect there are some very practical reasons for some of that. I suspect that some of that is because the previous slaves who had been in charge of the house were probably stealing from the master. They were working very hard when the master had their eye on him, but not otherwise. And I suspect that some of the slaves that had been there in the past had possibly even been taking advantage of the master's wife as well. Or at least she was taking advantage of them, just as she tried with Joseph. The difference is, and what she couldn't take was the fact that he stood up to her and rejected her. That he said no to her advances and said to her quite clearly and outrightly that this would be wrong to do that. Wrong against his master, whom he served faithfully. It would have been wrong against his Lord, whom he served faithfully. And so he said, no. He says, I will not do this. In fact, it says that he would not even stay in the house with her. He made sure that he was out of the way so that he couldn't possibly. And then, of course, eventually she entraps him. And we haven't got time to go on to that bit of the story. That's another time, perhaps. But I want you to notice that not only in the house, but we're told that actually out in the fields as well, the master noticed that he was prospering. That the influence of having godly Joseph in the house meant that everything in his house was being blessed, that God's favour was resting on the whole house. and Joseph had made it to the very top of the ladder, he was second only to the master himself. In fact, it says the master concerned himself with nothing except the food he ate. And I think that means that even there, that all he worried about was the fact that there's food on the table. And everything else that he didn't worry about at all. Being a military man in charge of the guard probably meant that he had to go on journeys quite often. The house is in safe hands. It's okay. I know I can come back and everything will be fine. Until, of course, that one day when Potiphar's wife resented Joseph for resisting her. Then we see the decisiveness of Potiphar. He's not prepared to listen to Joseph. He's outraged, has him thrown into prison, where he probably will be executed. But of course, God was with him in that too. As you go towards the end of the chapter 39, we read this about Joseph while he's in prison. Second half of verse 20 and on. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him, and he showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warder. So the warder put Joseph in charge of all that he held, of all those held in prison. Isn't that amazing? One prisoner put in charge of all the other prisoners. And he was made responsible for all that was done there. And the warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. That sounds so similar, doesn't it, to what happened when he was at Potiphar's house. That even though he then ended up in the prison, out of the comfort of the house, the Lord still prospered him. Things got worse. I mean, he probably thought to himself, it can't get much worse than being taken away from the freedom of living with my family, the favour of my father upon me, being sold into slavery, thinking I might die in Egypt, but then landing myself in the home of this guy Potiphar, who puts me into his house, gives me all the creature comforts that I could possibly desire, gives me actually relative freedom to do whatever I want in his house, and he doesn't care. He trusts me so much. But then, he says, it got into a nightmare. I finished up in the dirty dungeons. But Joseph remained faithful and upright no matter what. And as a result of remaining faithful and upright no matter what, the Lord's favour was upon him and he prospered him. What Joseph was doing was that he was honouring God every day of the week, every situation that he faced. And when we honour God and we act according to his will and his plan, this is part of our worship. This is part of what we give back to God. And we have to get away from the idea that worship is about coming into church and singing songs and reading the Bible and praying, and realising that it's a whole life experience. That when every part of my life is lived to please God, to honour him, to lift him up, that he is indeed glorified and worshipped and honoured. So as we go into the coming week, whatever you face, good or bad, whether you enjoy the work you do or not, I just ask you to view it again and say, how can I do this for Jesus? How can I make a difference for him? How can I do it without the complaining and the moaning and the resentment, and instead do it to his glory? Let's pray.